This is the I Read Comic Books podcast. I am your host, Mike Rappin. With me this week, two just pretty regular, fantastic people and one super stupendous human being. I'm here with Paul Jasley.
Hello.
Kait Lamphere.
Hi.
And library specialist, I don't know what the proper title is, Amie, I'm sorry, Amie Wright. Thank you so much for being here with us this week.
Thanks for having me.
You know, before we get into the show, I do want to ask, for all of you out there who are wondering who is this special guest, Amie, could you tell us just a little bit about yourself before we jump into what we've been reading and the regular questions I ask every single week?
Sure. So I am a comic book librarian, and for anybody listening, this is a relatively new specialty. We've certainly been around. Comics have been in schools and libraries for decades, but we actually just got professional recognition from the American Library Association. So to put it in sort of comic book and gamer language, the American Library Association is our professional guild. It is the oldest, largest library association in the world. So there's almost 100,000 members all across, and it represents libraries in Canada, the United States, and Mexico. But we also have international influences. And so we are the Graphic Novel and Comics Roundtable, and I am the first president, or as I like to joke, because I'm half Canadian, the first prime minister. So,
Well, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us and talk with us about comic books and all this stuff. And we're going to get probably into more of that in the second half of the show. But before we go too crazy talking about all that, I want to ask the question I ask every single week. How have you been? How have comic books been? Let's start with you, Kait.
I've been good. I have been trying to get through the 2020 Goodreads reading challenge, and I haven't gotten very far because I've been trying to read some of my other backlog first. But I've used all of my Hoopla checkouts, and I have 15 days to read a whole bunch of books now. So I'm going to stay busy.
I believe in you.
I did manage to get How to Treat Magical Beasts volumes 3 and 4 out of the physical library before they closed temporarily. This is by Kazuya. I've talked about this before. Ziska is the main character. She's training to become a veterinarian, but she has some magic, so of course she's the one that's finding all of these rare magical beasts around that need her help. Volume 3 ended on a potentially dark note. Ziska meets a new person who maybe doesn't have the best interests for her, and that's how the volume ends. So I was horrified and very glad that I had volume 4 already. And so that opened, and it wasn't quite as dark as I thought it might be, but it was definitely the darkest spot that this series has gone so far. And then volume 4 ended on another cliffhanger, but it was a much more whimsical one. So I've got a good ending temporarily until volume 5 comes out in December. I'm mad that I have to wait, but
right. This is the problem when you've got these really cool like manga volumes and series that are just like the hottest shit right now, and then you're like, oh wait, there's only 3 or 4 volumes out in English. Like, why did I put myself through this? Why did I do this? I have to wait too long for this.
Yeah, and then I also read the book of the month for our Goodreads group, which is Batgirl and the Birds of Prey, Volume 1. This is by Julie Benson, Shauna Benson, Claire Rowe, and then a whole bunch of other. It has a very large creative team, but those are the biggest names on the cover, I guess.
Yeah.
And this was my introduction to Batgirl and Canary, and I loved them. There was another character called the Huntress who was just grumpy the whole time. So I'm kind of iffy about her, but I already have volume 2 because I accidentally checked out volume 2 instead of volume 1 from the library, so I'm at least going to read the next volume.
Okay. Let me know how that is, because I was on the fence about reading the next volume of that series, because I did enjoy volume 1, but I wasn't completely sold on it, so you have to let me know how that goes.
Yeah, I pretty much felt the same way, except that I already have volume 2, so I'm just going to read it.
Okay. Well, Paul, what about you? How have you been? How have comic books been?
I've been good. The issue I'm running into is I have so much free time that combined with the huge stacks of comics I have laying around to catch up on, I find myself not knowing where to start. I feel like that. I feel like the Burgess Meredith character on that Twilight Zone episode when the world ends and he's in the library, right? And he comes out of the bunker and like he has all the time in the world to read, but he steps on his glasses. I haven't done that yet, but I feel like I don't know I feel like I don't know where to start with my my huge stacks of comics, but I managed to read a few things that I wanted to talk about. One was I read the book Bowie, Stardust, Rayguns, and Moonage Daydreams. This is the David Bowie biography that Mike Allred and Laura Allred did with Steve Horton that came out earlier this year. Mm-hmm. I'm a pretty casual David Bowie fan, but luckily this book focuses on the period I kind of know the best. It focuses on him getting into the music industry up through the release of the album Diamond Dogs. So that's like 1974. So it covers about, like a 5, 6, 7 year period in his life. And it's obvious that Michael Allred loves David Bowie. This feels like a passion project. The energy of the musical performances comes through the page, which it's often hard for comic book artists, I think, to capture the energy of musical performance in the sort of, flat, silent medium of comics. But he does a really good job of that here. There's so many awesome just splash pages of Bowie playing live or, the band rehearsing. It just looks, you can hear the music through the page almost, Yeah. And there's some amazing like splash pages he does where it'll be a visual interpretation of lyrics, so the song Life on Mars, which is, that's one of my favorite Bowie songs. There's a whole page where it's just the lyrics being drawn out, graphically. And it's a really striking image. So, that said, if you are a Bowie aficionado and know a lot of the lyrics, there's a lot of little Easter eggs and visual references for you to find. It's like, Where's Waldo sometimes, trying to find, if there's a crowd scene, like name the 60s rock star in the crowd. It's kind of fun to do that.
That's cool.
And there's an interesting framing device they use to explain this time period and why it was so creatively fruitful for David Bowie. And I'm glad that they focus on a really short period of time, but the last few double page spreads are basically these montages of the rest of his career. And it's like, boy, I really want that sequel. Give me the sequel where it's him and Iggy Pop hanging out in Berlin in the late 70s, or give me the sequel about him in the 90s. So hopefully they can do a follow-up to this book at some point, kind of cover the later career of David Bowie. Overall, I really enjoyed it. Even if you're not a Bowie fan, it's probably worth checking out. Maybe it'll turn you on to his music.
That sounds awesome, man. Especially with Mike Allred and Laura Allred on art, that's incredible.
Yeah, it's really visually striking. So the other book I caught up on was Far Sector. I read issues 2 through 5. This is the DC Young Animal title, written by N.K. Jemisin with art by Jamal Campbell. It's a Green Lantern adjacent type of comic where it's about a young upstart Green Lantern, a new Green Lantern, who is basically sent to the furthest sector in the universe, to a huge galactic city called City Enduring, to investigate a murder, the first murder that's occurred in the city for over 500 years. She drops into this city and discovers there's 3 different races inhabiting the city. They have a lot of tension, bad blood between them, and she's trying to navigate all that, at the same time investigate a murder in a society where they don't know how to investigate murders anymore, since it's been so long since there'd been one. So it's a really interesting mix of hard sci-fi, because N.K. Jemisin is a science fiction writer, and you can tell that they bring a lot of that hard sci-fi element to the story. There's a lot of pages where they're explaining the dynamics between the different races, a lot of the nuts and bolts example stuff of science fiction. On top of it, you have the police procedural, Mm-hmm. In that aspect, it really is a perfect Green Lantern story. And I also really liked Campbell's artwork. That said, it's that artwork that's there's a luminous quality to the coloring that I feel if you read it digitally, it's going to pop way more than the physical copies I'm reading. So I'm kind of actually curious to go back and reread it, or at least look at it when it comes out digitally. There's also a lot of Afrofuturism in the artwork, which I think is really interesting. And that ties into the social political commentary of the book. The last couple issues that I read really sort of focus on Sojourner Mullen. That's the Green Lantern the book is based on, or focuses on. It focuses on her past history on Earth, issues of, racism, issues of police brutality, issues of, political protest that comes up in the book. So it feels like a very contemporary take on, a Green Lantern story. Luckily, if you don't know anything about the Green Lantern, it's not connected to the current continuity. You can pick this up and enjoy it on its own without worrying about any of that. So far, I'm really, really enjoying this book. I think it's a 12-issue mini, so we'll see how it wraps up, if it does at this point. So
awesome. Yeah. You've almost interested me in a Green Lantern book. I don't understand it. So maybe I'll check this out. This sounds really cool, man.
Yeah, I definitely highly recommend it.
Amie, what about you? Have you how have you been? How have comic books been? Have you been reading anything lately that you want to tell us about?
Totally. I think one of the assumptions about a librarian is that we read all the time. And the truth is, we don't always read everything in its entirety. I'm surrounded by books and have yet to, push through a huge one. But two that I want to spotlight that I've been reading now. I've started Jean Lewin Yang's new Superman Smashes the Klan. So this is being released as periodicals through DC Comics. And this is actually based on the historical 1940s Superman radio serial, which is called Clan of the Fiery Cross. And so I was actually able to get, I'm very happy, an advanced reading copy that collected a bunch of the periodicals ahead of time. And it's really good. So it's, targeted at sort of a middle grade, upper teen audience. And it's the year is 1946. And the Lee family has just moved from Metropolis's Chinatown to the center of the bustling city. And so it talks a lot about Superman. It's sort of his origin story, but you also have it told through the Lee family and the two kids in the family. And I found it really compelling. The advanced reading copy I had, that has a lot of really good back matter of Gene Yang talking about the inspiration and sort of his own family's origin story, how he came to comics, and also how he thinks that comics can be such an important metaphor for talking about history. And also, I think, reinvigorating that story of Superman in a way that sometimes gets minimized or flattened. I should note that, I'm sort of a librarian, but I'm also a full-time history graduate student right now. So I'm focusing on comics and history. So pretty much this explains what I'm reading. So I've got Superman Smashes the Klan. And then the other comic that I've been reading, but that I've actually had a few back issues that I just haven't had a chance to get around to, and I read them this week, was Bitterroot, because I have finally been catching up on Watchmen. Yeah. And what the Watchmen series, it opens with the 1921 Tulsa race massacre, and this is something that's sort of forgotten to history. It's not something that before Watchmen, and actually Bitterroot makes allusions to it as well. It's not something that has a lot of historical notation. So I've been going back and reading Bitterroot, and actually I've started rereading Watchmen, which is awesome. And I just love also the way that they all play with history and sort of they themselves act as historical documents for the creators sort of responding to the world around them. So that's all really serious and weighty. So I'm trying to balance that with, at the suggestion of one of my friends, I started reading Hexvet, which is a series published by Boom. And it's sort of really targeted as upper teen, but also like as an adult reader. I really love it. And it's basically a vet clinic, but it's a magical vet clinic. And it's really endearing. The artwork is lovely and light and exactly the sort of fluffy yet comedic counterpart to the sort of the historical weighty sci-fi inspired stuff that I've been reading. So.
Well, I've never heard of this Hexvet book, and I just looked it up, and it looks adorable. So I'm glad that you're balancing things between some of the very heavier stuff that you mentioned. Well, for me, I've been reading a whole bunch of manga. Like, let me just be honest. I talked about Haikyuu last week on the show and how I kind of dropped off of it, and I went back into my comics reading log because I have that because I can't keep track of everything that I've read, and I realized that I hadn't read a volume of Haikyuu in over almost a year and a half, and I was kind of kicking myself for it because I love that series. And so I did a little bit of tracing around in the Shonen Jump app, and I've managed to figure out where I had left off. And then I sat down and I read like 25 chapters in a sitting, because boy, oh boy, volleyball is extremely exciting when you're reading it in manga form. So so I read a little bit of that, but I also want to talk about two books that I really spent a bunch of time on. I read Wasted Space number 15. This is by Michael Maurizi with art by Hayden Sherman and colors by Jason Wordie. And this is the end of the third arc of this series. If you haven't been reading, then none of this matters, because that's pretty much the point of the book. Nothing matters. We just kind of need to live out in this big universe that we call life. But I feel like I was a little bit lost in this arc of the series, and I realized that Maurizi was trying to get our main character Billy to a place where he could round off the arc in such a way that it almost made me want to cry. And I understand like that some of the stuff in the middle of this arc kind of didn't make sense, but it needed we basically needed to break down this character Billy to the point where he had to really, really focus only on himself rather than usually just being a shithead to everybody. And I really, really liked how it all played out. This probably makes no sense if you've never read this series, but I want to say that somehow this very sarcastic, very cynical space sci-fi story managed to have like a really big heart in the end of this arc. So I was really impressed by that. I also want to talk about another book that I did not realize came out last week until I checked the Comixology homepage, and this is Hellions #1. It's a new X-Men book. I think it's a miniseries. I don't know. It doesn't matter. It's written by Zeb Wells with art by Steven Segovia, and I just want to say we need to hold the goddamn phone here because this book is the most insane X-Men book I've read in a very long time. Hands down, it's full of the most out there weird villains that are now considered on the team of the X-Men because all mutants are welcome on the Krakoa Island, and like there are 2 robot characters. Like it's all characters that I've never heard of before with the exception of like one of them. And it was one of the Age of Apocalypse, like, I didn't write down any of the characters' names, but it's that little, like, mongrel, vicious killer character that's in Age of Apocalypse. And then there's a bunch of other people. It is the most insane book. I don't know who gave Zeb Wells permission to write the wildest X-Men book out there. I don't know who let him write Sinister in the best way that I've ever seen Mr. Sinister written. Like, he's so high and mighty and so sarcastic and so just lovely. I don't know how else to describe it. And Steven Segovia's art is zany and perfect. Like it's very Capes comic book, but at the same time allows for a lot of really cartoonish humor in it. I really think that if you're looking for a weird X-Men book to just kind of jump into that has no ramifications, because clearly this is basically Suicide Squad, but for X-Men. And they're all probably going to die in the end. I'm not really sure. This book is totally for you. I want to say like it was just a wild ride. I keep saying that over and over, but yeah, this book was really great for me. I think it was like the #1 pick for a ton of people, so this is probably not news to anybody out there that's reading X-Men books, but man, this book really was just a genuinely fun read in the sea of X-Men kind of garbage that exists there right now. This one was really, really nice. It's a nice highlight. So yeah.
Okay, I'll try it, Mike.
I know. I'm only saying all of this to try to get Paul on board because I think of all of the other books, I think you actually might enjoy this one.
Okay, I'll give it a shot. Yeah.
But yeah, let's talk about comic books that are coming out this upcoming week or in the near future. Comic books are hopefully dropping on April 1st, 2020. I'm just going to assume that everything's going to function as normal until I hear otherwise, because as far as I know, digital comic books are still coming out on Wednesday. I know there's a whole big thing with Diamond and distribution and local comic shops. That's a whole other big conversation. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Either send us a message on Twitter, jump on our Discord and have a conversation with us. I know we have fans from all across the country and literally all across the world. We have some folks in the UK and Australia that jump on our Discord, and we've all kind of been talking about this. So let us know your thoughts. But anyways, let's talk about comic books that we think are coming out on April 1st, 2020. What are you excited for this week? I'm going to start with you, Paul.
This is a pretty obvious pick, but I'm going to pick Strange Adventures #2. I really like the first issue of this series. This is, of course, the new Adam Strange series written by Tom King. Art duties split between Mitch Gerrits and Evan Shaner. Adam Strange is one of those really strange DC Legacy characters in that no one really knows what to do with him, but he keeps popping up all the time. He seems like a holdover from the sort of, pre-Silver Age sci-fi comics boom, right? Mm-hmm. And he has a very simple gimmick. He's just a guy who gets sucked into a zeta beam and flown across the galaxy to another planet every once in a while, and then he comes back. What do you do with that? There's not much you can do with that. But Tom King, I think, had an interesting hook with the first issue where, Adam Strange is being accused of being a war criminal while he's on the planet Ron, the planet he goes to via zeta beam. And it made an interesting use of the split art duties because Mitch Gerrits is doing the stuff based on Earth. Evan Shaner is doing the more sort of Silver Age superhero adventure stuff on the other planet, which works really well for his art style. And I don't want to project too much or assume too much, but I really feel that Tom King is one of those writers that puts his personal life and personal feelings into his work, whether consciously or subconsciously. And this book feels like his reaction to some of the negative critiques of Heroes in Crisis, as well as that sort of recent news story or the rumblings online that people were questioning his claims to be involved with the CIA or what he actually did to the CIA. All of that seems to be here in this book, whether he intended it or not. So I think that adds another layer to the book. Yeah, I'm a sucker for Tom King at this point. Even if it doesn't always land or it doesn't always stick the landing for me, I kind of like his approach. And again, I think Garrett and Shane are a really interesting art team. Seeing them work side by side, it's a really interesting book. So hopefully I can get my hands on a copy before too long.
Gotcha. So, and this is the way to get Evan Shaner to actually be on a monthly book. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I think both of those guys probably need a little more breathing room to make a monthly schedule work. So yeah, it works out.
Absolutely. Very cool. Well, Amie, I'm going to pitch over to you. Is there anything that you're excited about that's coming out in the next maybe week or a couple weeks?
I've been following Wonder Woman. So Love is a Battlefield, which is volume 2, is slated to come out April 1st. So I've really been following that and liking that as a series. I am not usually a DC reader, but, I became a big fan. I really like what they're doing with Wonder Woman and with this series. I think it's actually providing a really good sort of reintroduction for people. If we hear from a lot, especially in libraries and schools, for people that maybe aren't long-term comics readers, and they're always looking for new entry points. They're like, there's such a great lineage. Like, how do I start? Mm-hmm. And I think this series provides a really nice entry point. So I'm hoping that I can get a copy on April 1st.
Fingers crossed. Very cool. Yeah, this is the G. Willow Wilson one, right?
Yep.
Very cool. Yeah, I've been meaning to try her stuff. I mean, everything that G. Willow Wilson does, I always want to try the volume 1. So maybe because you've reminded me, I'll pick up volume 1 of this Wonder Woman run.
Okay.
Very cool. Kait, what about you? What are you excited for this upcoming week?
I checked out quite a few number ones this week, and it looks like there's some kind of weird female-led James Bond theme going on.
Okay.
The one that I'm the most interested in is called Spy Island: A Bermuda Triangle Mystery. This is by Chelsea Kane, Elise McCall, Rachel Rosenberg, and Leah Metternich. Mm-hmm. The description is: super spy Nora Freud, no relation, has a plum assignment. Keep an eye on things. In this particular den of intrigue, populated by spies, tourists, and evil villains set in global domination. So, I'm interested. The cover has this kind of matte 90s look to it, which kind of informs that James Bond theme to me. Mm-hmm. But then the interior looks like pretty modern artwork that I like. Pretty colorful. There's some scenes of scuba diving in the first couple of pages, it looks like, which I've done before. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. Coupled with the mystery theme of this, I'm pretty interested. I'm gonna have to find a way to check this out next week.
Yeah, I've never heard of this. I noticed that as I was looking up new books for this week, there's a ton of number ones coming out.
Yeah.
Which is strangely unfortunate, but this one looked really cool. The cover alone is gorgeous. I can totally see just that drawing your eye. But for me, this week, I'm excited for 2 books. I'm just going to mention one very quickly, and then I'm going to move on to the other. Nailbiter Returns number 1. This is Joshua Williamson and Mike Henderson. Looks like this is the sequel to their series Nailbiter, which, if you haven't read Nailbiter, it's all about a serial killer who, I guess it's all about a serial killer who grew up in a town that has spawned numerous serial killers over many years. And so the story follows a detective who's trying to get to the bottom of why are all of these serial killers coming from this one town. What is it that makes this happen? And I won't spoil how the book ends because it's a very strange, convoluted way to get to the end of this story. But ultimately, I really, really liked it. I think Joshua Williamson and Mike Henderson did a great job. And the fact that they're coming back to this series makes me wonder what more story they have to tell. So I'm very much on board for that. The other book that I'm very excited about is the Ludocrats number 1. This is Jim Rossignol and Kieran Gillen with artists Jeff Stokely and Tom Bonvillain. And this is the Ludocrats, the aristocrats of Ludicrous, a collision of the ornate fantasy of Dune and an M-rated asterisk and Obelix. I don't know what this possibly could be, other than I know it's Kieran Gillen's baby that he's been trying to do for like 6 or 7 years. So I'm on board. It's a 5-issue miniseries. The cover looks great, and the art in general looks gorgeous and wild and zany. And I'm excited to see Kieran Gillen do something that is still probably going to be way over my head, but also very goofy. So yeah, count me in for that. But yeah, I guess let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to be talking to Amie all about libraries and comic books and what it means to be a librarian of comics, and maybe a couple other things. We'll see. But yeah, we'll be back in just a second. For our show this week, we are, as I said, talking with Amie Wright, librarian president of the Comics and Graphic Novels Roundtable. Is that what I heard correctly? Yeah, and so I guess to get things started, Amie, I know you kind of touched on it at the beginning of the episode, but could you tell us a little bit about your background in comics and working within the library system?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing, and it's definitely something that's been talked about in comics, or maybe, if you will, talked around as we talk around things like the direct market and everything. Mm-hmm. This whole library market is actually the largest growing market for comics, period. Mm-hmm. Gina Gagliano from Random House Graphics has talked about this quite a bit, especially with the kids' comic market. But I mean, schools and libraries, they buy comics in very large numbers. So that's sort of where our roundtable comes, and sort of where I come into all of this, is that I had always been a comics reader. I think for most of us who do this kind of work, we always have been, but we sort of either stopped or, whatever. I think that the lingering stigma is real, sometimes still around comics reading, sadly. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I kind of, I didn't read as much sci-fi. I didn't read as many comic books as I got older as an adult. And then when I became a librarian, it was also my introduction. I'm not a big manga reader. That's something that I have on my to-do list right now. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that was really amazing working in the library was to see, we had all the issues of Naruto. And I mean, for so many readers, that is amazing because there's so many issues, right? And to be able to come into the library and get those, check those out, but also have that browsability experience, and also for it to not be cost prohibitive. And I was like, oh, wow, I didn't quite realize that even though I'd been working in a library for a long time, even though I'd been a comics reader, I didn't really realize that this was sort of, if you will, an untapped market that we had in the library. And then with the schools, I mean, if you talk to school librarians and actually ask them to pull what we would call circulation statistics, so which books are checked out the most, it's comic books. I mean, mostly it's a lot of Raina Telgemeier and obviously Dave Pilkey, Gene Yang, a lot of Amulet, but it's a lot of comic books. So, I mean, there's this huge burgeoning market, and it sort of had been alluded to for a long time. I mean, going way back when, Will Eisner is in the 70s really petitioning school libraries and public libraries to buy more comics. And he's hitting a lot of pushback. And this is right around the time that, you're starting to see like graphic novel come into use. And I think for a lot of people, it's a little bit more palatable for a school library market. Oh, it's a graphic novel. It's not a comic book. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so it's all sort of been something that's been percolating for a long time, but especially in the past 5 to 10 years, I mean, we're seeing, especially with kids comics, like they are outperforming the rest of the print market, and especially in schools and libraries. And that sort of goes against the narrative of the direct market and general comic sales. And it's this interesting, weird thing. And I never thought I would be a comic book librarian. Here I am.
Right. I kind of have like a tangent question off of that. And I know we wanted to maybe avoid the full direct market discussion, but at the same time, do you think that the success of some of these kids comics is just because of the distribution capabilities of some of the publishers, like Raina Telgemeier, like her stuff gets published through Scholastic, or she gets published through a major like prose book publisher, right?
I think that definitely helps, but I also think if you look at some of the comic stores that I think are not only doing well, but also really thriving, it's comic stores that have diversified their market. Right. And of what they're stocking and also their approach. A lot of comic book stores who have partnered with schools and libraries to actually act as a vendor for the schools, for the libraries, doing book fairs for the schools. I think you're seeing a huge pickup and a real diversification of readership of comics through the stores that have done that. And just very pragmatically, I think when we talk about the reading of comics, if you will, I'm an expert on reading. I'm not an expert, but like in libraries, we talk about it. And I think the stores that have really embraced multiple format reading of comics, like really facilitating easy browsability of web comics, digital reading platforms of comics, but also single issues and bound and trade editions. And I think the stores that have done that are some of the stores that have had much more success than others. And I mean, when we talk about our public and our communities, I think that's the thing is any successful business for us, any successful community organization in a library, we're actively always thinking about our communities and our readership, and we're pivoting as things change. We're trying to meet people where they are instead of being like, this is what reading looks like. This is sort of where comics librarianship comes in, is that there was a lot of resistance, there still is, for a lot of libraries to purchase comics for especially public libraries. And one of the things that we've pointed to is that for the libraries that have built very strong comics collection, they have one of the highest, what we call ROIs, return on investment. So in terms of buying them and how often they go out. And so for a lot of libraries, we've used sort of the business case, but I think there's been resistance. Even we've seen for some libraries, they'll keep buying, your regular adult bestsellers, and they might go out a little bit, but they're overlooking the fact that like the market has changed for us too. And I think the libraries that are doing really well are being responsive to the changes. And I would say the same things with comic books. Like I think the stores that are doing well are being responsive and being like, wow, there's this great school library market. We could do book fairs and we could sell single issues, but we could also sell trades,
Very cool.
I feel pretty lucky in that my local library here in Grand Rapids does have a very well-stocked and well-curated comic book collection. And when I started reading comics again about a decade ago, that was a huge resource for me to find new stuff. But even still, I, as a frequent visitor of the library, and I know a lot of our listeners are big advocates for comics and libraries, there's still some confusion about how those books end up in the library to begin with. Do you maybe want to give a quick little nuts and bolts discussion of how libraries buy comics and how that sort of business side works?
Oh, totally. And I think not dissimilar from when we talk about the direct market, vending actually does impact access. For a lot of the schools and libraries, they're buying from usually a single vendor or maybe just one or two vendors. And so there is definitely an issue in terms of getting indie titles, single issue titles in libraries. So we have, if you will, the equivalent of Diamond for the library market. So in the US, we have two principal vendors, Baker and Taylor and Ingram. There's other vendors, but those are two of the bigger ones, especially for public libraries. And so libraries are purchasing through those vendors. And one of the things for us is, again, not dissimilar from the comic book market, we want to make sure that we're buying titles or what we would call, quote unquote, shelf ready. So books that already have ideally catalog records attached to them, so the metadata attached to them, so we can easily, seamlessly, not only physically add them to our collections, but digitally add them to the technological infrastructure that is our catalog. And that is prohibitive. So, obviously things like a lot of mass market titles and titles that are being published by obviously Macmillan for Second, Scholastic, there's a lot of representation of those titles in libraries. The other thing for libraries is sort of, it's a dorky thing to point out, but it's actually been very prohibitive, is a binding issue. So a lot of libraries are very reticent to buy single issues because they are like, oh, single issues, they won't survive. And so the tendency has been to only purchase things in a bound edition, and usually again through two of our major vendors. One of the things that we definitely have been trying to work on through the Roundtable and talking about comics advocacy is we really should be buying for our community. So that means diversifying how we buy. And also, we have always had magazines and newspapers in the library. So if we're worried about single issues, it's sort of that argument doesn't hold water.
Right.
So definitely the buying thing has been prohibitive for some. That's why when we do partner with comic stores, we say, there is definitely an untapped thing here, especially for single issues. So many libraries are buying from these major vendors, so they're only getting books that are already published, in like the trade paperback collected editions. They don't necessarily have the newest single issues. This would be a really great opportunity. So we're starting to see that. Some major library systems have done that, where they'll partner with a comic book store. One of the most successful, very large examples is the Beguiling comic book store in Toronto. That's one of the main sponsors of the Toronto Comic Arts Festival. They are actually an approved vendor for comic books all throughout Ontario. And so they actually partner with the schools and the Toronto Public Library. In Quebec, in Montreal, you also have Drawn and Quarterly fulfills a similar role. So we're starting to see, I think, more of that kind of partnership. But yeah, for us, vending is definitely something that is prohibitive towards us having a broad collection as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you mentioned off mic that most of your job is from home, I assume at a desk, but do you ever go out and do like table at events, for example?
Oh yeah, this is in fact how I met Mike and Paul. So one of the things that we do through the Roundtable, and one of the things that I've done a lot, I have probably been to, it's hard. I wish I could take a photo and send it to you. Maybe I will, because I have all my badges from all of the library conventions, but also all the Comic-Cons that I've been to over the past 5 years. It's probably been about 70 or 80. So we actually do, through the Graphic Novel and Comics Roundtable, we do sessions at Comic-Con. So some of the largest things we do are C2E2. Mm-hmm. We have a pop-up library on the Comic-Con floor. So we have a booth that is essentially like a library on the Comic-Con floor. We have comfortable chairs. We have a browsing collection. We have for kids coloring sheets. We actually are doing story time there. And so that's an advocacy piece. We'll do reading recommendations through the library as well, the pop-up library. But we also have panel sessions. But those panels are sort of intended audience are librarians and educators, but also parents, people in the community, people at comic stores, and creators themselves to just consider, a broad market. Like if you have never considered writing a kid's comic, this might be a great time to do so. And for people in the kids comic market, like it would be really cool to partner with somebody and do an adult title. And just really talking about the fact that comics readership, as we've seen it, is so much broader. Our largest event that we do is for New York Comic Con. So for a long time, I work from home now because I'm a full-time grad student, but I was a library manager for more than a decade. And I worked at the New York Public Library managing the school outreach program there for about 3.5 years. And I was also the collection development librarian on that for 1.5 years. And one of the things before I had left New York Public, along with a colleague, Emily Drew at New York Public, we created an event called New York Comic Con at the New York Public Library. And it's at, New York Comic Con, you're at Javits, so you're right on the 7 line. So just 2 stops is the central library for New York Public, right in Bryant Park. And we have a whole day of professional development sessions. So targeted again to librarians and educators, talking about like how to use comics in the classroom, how to add comics to your library collections. And we had this past fall, it was like 30 simultaneous sessions we had going on that day. We had several keynote sessions, and we had about 3,500 educators and librarians attend. So it's a lot of Comic-Conning. Like typically I would go to 1 or 2 cons a month. And that includes San Diego, Toronto Comic Arts Festival, Emerald City, C2E2. We actually had programming scheduled for WonderCon as well in Anaheim. So yeah, we're trying to, in some ways, have a presence at all of the cons, ideally in North America,
right?
Just to continue to promote that advocacy message.
Wow, that's a lot of conventions. Even just the handful you listed, I'm like, that's a whole weekend of your life that is just exhausting. And then you go and do it again, like you said, 2 or 3 weeks later. I mean, there was what was it, 2 years ago, and it was C2E2 and Emerald City back to back. Like that's wild.
Yeah, I did not do the back-to-back. I think that we had some other librarians from West Coast who had covered Emerald City that year, and I was so glad because I was like, I can't do that.
Right. Well, and you mentioned like the graphic novels and comics roundtable kind of came to be pretty recently. I guess how did that all get started? And the bigger question is, what convinced you to run for president?
Jeez, I don't know. That's a great question. I'll circle back to that.
Okay.
So this is definitely work that's been going on for a long time. So, I mentioned you have a bunch of people advocating for this going back to the 1970s. So Will Eisner had actually written a editorial for School Library Journal, which is one of our professional journals, in 1974, really trying to make the case for comics in school and library collections. And so we started, for us, a lot of times we point to, there's a few like watershed moments in the mid 2000s. You have Jeff Smith Bone, right? So obviously he published it independently, and then you all of a sudden have the creation of Scholastic's imprint, and Bone is the first Scholastic graphic title, and it just takes off, it breaks all the publishing records. Not to mention then you have the dawn of Raina and Gene Yang and everything. And this is where we really see, I think, with somebody like Scholastic that has always partnered so much with schools and libraries. So for us in the American Library Association, we have a large annual conference. So our annual conference, every year it depends on attendance, but it's anywhere between, I'm going to say like 20 to 40,000 people that attend our annual conference. So these are people who work in libraries all throughout the world. Yep. And so we had ours scheduled for Chicago in this coming June. And we've been doing programming at our annual conference. This is for more than a decade. And we also have what we call an artist alley on the convention floor of the American Library Association annual conference, where we have individual creators tabling. Gail Simone has been there, Raina Telgemeier, Nathan Hale. If you don't know, he does really great history comics for kids called Nathan Hale's Hazardous Tales. He's tabled for us several times. And so I think things just started to pick up. We also have some, very famous comics librarians who come before me. Robin Brenner, who's written comics books on manga and is out of, she's actually in Brookline, Massachusetts, right outside of Boston. And so a lot of people have been doing the work for a long time. C2E2, I just found out, the American Library Association has actually had a presence at C2E2 for a decade. So all of this is happening and it's going on, but we still don't have professional recognition. We were within our guild called what's a member interest group. So basically a loose knit kind of volunteer organization within our professional guild. And it just sort of, I think things reached a head in which you have San Diego Comic-Con. They've been doing professional sessions at the San Diego Public Library. It's been 4 or 5 years. I got involved with New York Comic-Con because ReadPop has almost for the past decade offered professional badges for educators and librarians. You can actually go to Comic-Con either for free for one day, or you can go for all 4 days, for example, for New York for a discounted rate. And I remember when I found this out, I was like, oh my goodness. You know how hard it is to get a Comic-Con badge.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
This is even how I ended up at San Diego. My brother lived in Southern California, and I remember getting him his tickets for his birthday and, waiting online and to put my name in the hat. So potentially I could apply for a badge a year later. So I found out that, as a librarian that San Diego was doing stuff, I was like, I got to go to San Diego. So there was one year that I went to, because the Toronto Comic Arts Festival, they have a librarian and educator day too. San Diego has librarian and educator programming. C2E2 has librarian and educator programming. And then I, along with my colleague Emily, had started that for New York. So we have this groundswell of things that kind of all came together. I always really inappropriately like to make an Avengers comment. That was Tina Coleman, who's she works in our membership office for the American Library Association. She was very strategic and put a bunch of us in contact with each other. I'm a dual citizen between the US and Canada, and I've lived and worked in both countries, in libraries in both countries. And so there's a few of us who have contacts in a few different places. My family's in Southern California, but I was living in New York for a long time. And I think it helped that there was a bunch of us doing similar work and also being pretty mobile all around North America. Mm-hmm. And as you know, the con community is in itself kind of a virtual community. We see each other in person just a handful of times a year, but people are in touch, and it just was kind of a nice groundswell. We also have really good support and feedback from the graphic medicine community. So if you're not familiar with them, this is a group of doctors, nurses, medical practitioners, medical librarians, who've been using graphic medicine. So I like to call it sort of a meeting of, if you will, art therapy and bibliotherapy for training for doctors and nurses, for patient diagnosis, patient therapy, and really so many fantastic uses of that. Especially graphic medicine memoirs, people have found really useful in getting patients and families to talk about diagnosis. So this community is also starting right around the same time. It's interesting right now as we're recording this, Ian Williams, who's one of the founders of the graphic medicine community, he's out of the UK and he's a doctor. So he's very busy right now. Right. So all of this kind of came together right at the same time. And I think it feels sort of serendipitous, but also like it was maybe, to make a library joke, long overdue. But yeah, so we just got official status. It's just a little over a year and a half ago. So we'll have our 2-year anniversary of being an official roundtable this June.
Well, congrats. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Now, to the big question, though, like, how did you come to be the president of this? I mean, I again, I don't want to put you under too much pressure here, but I am curious, like, it sounds like there's a lot of very, like, incredible people involved, and you are the head of it. How did you get there? Like, that's so cool that you are essentially the president running this whole thing, right?
Yep. I don't know.
Okay.
It's kind of funny. With the program I ran in New York, so, when you're a librarian, some of the library goals, like, if you will, in the con world, it's like, I want to go to San Diego. And then, like, the next goal is like, I want to present at San Diego,
mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So in the library world, it's like, I want to work at New York Public Library. So when I started working at New York Public, I was hired. The whole system was in a freeze, and I got hired it was grant funded. And so I was like, oh, this is amazing. I'm like living my dream.
Mm-hmm.
And so I worked on this project for a year and a half, and I was building the collection for this school library partnership. And what I didn't realize is, like, I just found myself kind of in the right place or at the right time. New York City was going through a huge changes with the introduction of what's called the Common Core State Standards, so new educational standards that were introduced in the US. And New York City was one of the first adopters. So suddenly I'm building this educational collection, and there's a whole bunch of national scrutiny on the work I'm doing, because New York City is one of the first programs to do this, first cities to do this. I'm working at New York Public, which is one of the largest library systems in the world. Mm-hmm. And then I go on to manage this program. So when I started managing the program, what I didn't really realize was it's the largest school library program in the world. So so I'm running this multi-million-dollar initiative. We're working with about a quarter of the schools in New York, so more than 500 schools. I'm working at New York Public, so that covers 3 boroughs of New York City, so the Bronx, Manhattan, and Staten Island. Mm-hmm. Queens and Brooklyn have their own system, but I had counterparts in each of the systems, and then I was the lead on the program for the whole city. And yeah, I sort of feel the same way like about the comics librarianship thing. I was just doing this work, and I was helping organize panels, and because I was sort of in this weird position in which, in New York, we had funding to go to conferences. And so, I was really trying to make connections within educational communities. So I went to the social studies teachers conference, because there's a lot of use in comics and teaching history. Mm-hmm. And I also was like, oh, I want to check out more of this educational programming around comics. And so I went to a bunch of the cons. I'm somebody who has traveled a lot. That's just sort of what I do. And I don't think I realized it was going to be it's like the program I ran in New York. I was like, oh, this is fine.
Well, no, it's really cool. Like I'm very excited for you. That's very awesome. I mean, I guess the other question I have about that is, what kind of responsibilities do you have as the president of this roundtable?
So even that has been more than I thought. So we, within the American Library Association, because we are, as I said, the oldest, largest library organization in the world, even getting a roundtable added was a lot more work than I think all of us realized, because it's such a large, old organization. They don't want to add divisions just because, right? Mm-hmm. So even to get the paperwork and the support, we had to send out a petition to membership and get a groundswell of support before they would essentially even hear the petition to add this. We were actually the first roundtable added to the American Library Association in 5 years, and at a time in which they were trying to sort of actively discourage, because it makes sense. We're such a large organization, you don't want to add parts just because. And then what's been really interesting is we've probably become one of the fastest growing roundtables in the history of the American Library Association. I think it speaks to the popularity of the work and also the fact that so many people have done the work to begin with. So in a very short time, we have, so as president, I have a board. So we do have an 8-member board. And so I'm responsible for oversight of that board. But then we also have 10 different committees, and each of the committees has more than 20 volunteers. And those committees are, we have a membership committee to speak to our members, but then some of our more high profile committees are, we have a convention committee. So that is responsible for either directly planning programming or helping to support local programming at all the different cons that we have a presence at. So C2E2, New York, San Diego, Anaheim WonderCon, et cetera, et cetera. We have our conference committee, so that's planning for our annual conference. We have a resources and toolkits committee, so that's developing resources around comics, libraries, and schools. And yeah, we have a reading list. So we actually are doing our own adult graphic novel reading list because there's so many awards out there for comics, not so many, but there are a lot of awards for comics, but especially within librarianship, a lot of those awards are only for kids comics or for teen comics. The Yelsa Great Graphic Novels does a great job. We've started to see a lot better recognition of kids comics. A comic, of course, Jerry Craft's New Kid won the Newbery Award, first time ever in January, but there's not so much of an appreciation for adult readership of comics, I would say, in libraries in the way that we'd like to see it. In most libraries, for example, the budget that they have allocated for buying comics, it still tends to fall under the purview of either the children's or the teen librarian. That's actually not budgeted in the adult collection. So we have an adult reading list, so that's another committee. Yeah, we have a grant that we administer with actually the Will Eisner Family Foundation, and it's 3 grants that we give out to a library every year. And so 3 individual grants, and each of the grants are more than $6,000 US, and it's money to purchase comics, it's a donation of comics, and it's also money to support somebody from the library to attend our annual conference. So that's just some of
I mean, that's awesome. That's incredible. I mean, this is all stuff that really warms my heart as someone who, for some reason, hadn't really gotten invested in using a library until I moved to New York, and I had one of the greatest public library systems available to me. The work shows. Like it's great that this type of stuff exists. I can't thank you enough for it. You and all the other librarians out there. I mean.
I think and that's also part of what we've realized is that what we're doing is a lot of comics librarianship, but it's library advocacy. Every time we're on the Comic-Con floor, it is actually the coolest feeling in the world when kids come up and they're like, wow, what are you doing here? You're from the library? And we're like, yeah, we're comic librarians. And the kids are like, that's a thing? And we're like, uh-huh. But I think also to do that community outreach aspect, it's definitely in librarianship. We are a profession that, we have our own struggles. We're definitely a profession that, in so much as we've done a lot of advocacy work, we also have been known to be gatekeepers at times. And so a lot of the work that we're doing is not just around comics, it's also around trying to better meet our communities where they're at, and also get our profession a little bit up to speed on things that are going on. We don't do a great job, for example, of aggregating or collecting webcomics. And I've heard feedback from a lot of libraries, well, that's hard. And I'm like, okay, I hear what you're saying. But if people are reading webcomics, shouldn't we do a job of reflecting our communities to actually figure out a way that we can host that? The Library of Congress, most people don't realize, beyond having one of the largest collections of comics in the world, they actually have a web comics web archive that you can go to. And it's awesome. They have dinosaur comics, they have Hark a Vagrant, Hyperbole and a Half, and a really great collection. And so I love to point to Library of Congress to be like, hey, y'all, if Library of Congress is doing this,
right.
So we're trying to sort of use this not only to advocate for comics, but also advocate for our profession being a little bit maybe more responsive and pivoting to be there for our communities. So that, because we hear that from a lot of people. You're not the only person who's like, wow, I didn't realize that libraries had all this. Like it's a constant thing that we're always kind of battling with. So.
Is there anything that the average person can do to like help you in your initiatives, particularly right now?
Oh, geez. Yeah. So one thing that we have been trying to do, and we actually just launched it on Friday night, is we launched our hashtag and our social media platforms are LibComics, LIBCOMIX. And so we launched a new initiative called LibComics Online. And one of the things we're trying to do is bring the advocacy we would normally do in person in the cons, in person in the libraries, online. And so we actually are doing reading recommendations. We're also trying to signal boost other digital initiatives and just trying to raise awareness of that. So I think one thing that I would encourage everybody is a lot of what we do, again, is not just about advocacy for our profession, it's also advocacy around reading. So I would say, if you're not a comics reader right now, like there's a comic for you. Mm-hmm. And I think especially we have a lot of people who are all of a sudden homeschooling their kids. And I know a lot of people are really at loose ends, and I totally get that. I would say comics, they are real reading. I know it's said enough. And for a lot of us, we're like, I can't believe we're still advocating for this. I think some people still need to hear it. And I think that would be definitely something to have that assurance that, this is real reading. There's really great resources out there, and there are librarians here to help you. So I think signal boosting and just talking about reading as well. I don't know. I think for all of us, we're in this weird holding pattern.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
We're huge advocates, for reading comics. I guess, like, beyond the current situation that we're in right now, what can people do to advocate for libraries in general? Like, what would be your best recommendation for folks to say, I want to help my local library? Like, what's the best thing they can do?
I think one of the best things is to use the library, to become a library member. One of the things we have heard from people is, well, I don't think the library has what I'm looking for. If they don't have what they're looking for, put in a request. I mean, what we are actually that is what we're under is we want to make sure that we're buying things that reflect our community requests. So every library should have a collection request form, so essentially a buying request. So put in that request, support your library through checking out materials, so many digital reading platforms. We do depend a lot on membership and circulation statistics. So the more you use the library, the better the library will be. I would definitely say for anybody, when it comes time to vote for public library budget or school library budgets, there's so many reasons why your library is supportive. There's even been research done by real estate agents that if you have an active, wonderful school and public library, your housing value will be better. It's a win-win. And I don't think people quite realize that. And I definitely think it's something we've talked about in our profession, that sometimes we take it for granted that people know the value of a library, and that we need to do a better job at advocating. And I think even to hear from people personally, their library stories and them sharing their stories with others, that really helps. One of the stories I love to share is, I don't know if you know that Tupac Shakur actually got his start at a public library.
They did not know that.
No.
True story. You can go, So Tupac Shakur, his library was the Enoch Free Public Library. And one of the cool things about the Enoch Free Public Library is the current Librarian of Congress, so Dr. Carla Hayden, she was actually the director of the Enoch Free Public Library for a long time. Not when Tupac was there, but Tupac Shakur won a local talent competition put on by the public library, and he actually rapped about library cards. Yep. I think
That's amazing.
An unacknowledged thing for a lot of people, that for so many people, the library it's a safe place. It's an after hours place. Like once school is out,
Mm-hmm.
it's for so many people, it's where they access Wi-Fi, or where they have a consistent Wi-Fi connection. It's access to a computer. There's been, right now with what we're in, and libraries have closed because as physical spaces, we are not helping things if we stay open. But one of the very pragmatic things that people have been wrestling with is, for so many people in our communities, Wi-Fi is a luxury. And so the library has that. But they also have really great support. I don't think people are aware that if you come into the library, we have career resources. We have resources to actually help you start your own small business. I mean, every library has career resources, business resources. And generally people get involved in libraries because they want to help people, you know?
Totally.
So
yeah, I guess, Paul, Kait, any final questions here? I was going to ask the big weird one that's out there, which is how does Hoopla factor into this? But I'll wait for Paul's question here.
Mike, you're reading my mind.
Okay.
That was my big question. It might be too big to get into all the details right now, but how does the new emergence of digital platforms like Canopy and Hoopla, does it operate the same way that just traditional physical library does in terms of buying and collections and all that?
I would say yes and no. It really depends on the library. For some libraries that have been more early adopters of digital reading, they've actually been able to integrate digital reading into a traditional library experience such that people are able to go into the catalog and find whatever available. So let's say I want to read Captain Marvel right now, and Captain Marvel is checked out, the physical copy, it'll immediately tell me, oh, we have a digital copy available. And a lot of academic libraries have worked on that model for about 10 to 20 years because so many academic publications are not published in print. They're only done, especially journals, academic journals are only done electronically. So for us in the public library and school library, it's definitely sort of playing catch up to a model that's been used by academic libraries for a long time. And I do think, though, that some libraries are doing it really well. Some libraries, I think it's a bit of a learning curve because it is a little different. And I think it showcases people's preferences sometimes for reading is that we have a lot of people that are still very physical print readers. I mean, personally, I actually do prefer a physical book myself. That being said, I'm always have to remind myself when I come to the job, it's not a matter of my personal preferences. I need to put on my professional hat. And so I think that it's something that is definitely still kind of in its infancy, but we have seen huge pickup for titles in both Hoopla, Overdrive, Canopy, and I think there's also great potential for discovery. Europe Comics made the choice to, as they were really trying to better expose their titles to especially an American market, they've released a lot of their titles digital only to just sort of get their titles out there without having to worry about taking on the cost of printing. And I think that's a great way to actually have that discovery layer and increase browsability of new titles. And it's given us more capacity also to represent indie titles, titles from smaller publishers, publishers for international publishers. And so we've been trying to push digital more and more, and especially right now. I'm really glad. I mean, I've actually given a lot of people the link to the Library of Congress webcomics archive and been like, hey, did you know this? Or do you know that you have titles in your Hoopla? Do you know that you have titles in Overdrive? And also talking about other digital reading platforms, because I don't think that that's something that everybody is on board with yet. The other thing is with so many webcomics, I mean, Instagram has become a really great platform for that. I mean, there's a lot that I follow on Instagram, and it's almost become, if you will, like the New Yorker platform for comics. And you have a great one panel or maybe a 4-panel comic on Instagram. And that's not something that we've incorporated yet, but we're trying to when we make reading recommendations. I will try to make a recommendation of this is a really great series in single issues. This is a really great series that's actually in a collected edition. This is a great web comic, and this maybe an Instagram comic. So I try to think about the different formats in terms of reading when I make recommendations now.
Is there any way that people that aren't librarians aren't involved in that community? Is there any way for us average just comic book fans who are advocates for libraries to be involved in the roundtable, or are there openings there?
Oh, 100%. So it's funny that you should say this. So this episode will air soon, right?
Yeah, it's going to air on the 1st.
Okay, so guess what? On the 1st, our volunteer forum is still open. But no, we've had, I would say, A lot of our membership is definitely people that work in libraries, but we have so many members that are library adjacent. So people that are educators, people that work in comic book stores, creators themselves. One of our great advocates and a very active member has been Chris Aaron, the comics journalist from New Llama. And Chris had actually organized, we had a big advocacy push in September. It was called Creators Get Carded, and it was comics creators posing with their public library cards to really promote the public library and that mutually beneficial relationship between comic creators and libraries. I was really excited. We kicked that off with a photo of Chip Zdarsky making bug eyes at the camera. Posing with his public library card. It was great. And we had huge uptick from that. We had such a great feedback from creators. We actually featured more than one creator every day for all of September. So all told, we had almost 40 creators participate in that. And that was a really nice way of just publicizing that, like, hey, I'm a creator and I use the library, or these are the libraries I use. And I think even for people in the library who maybe weren't aware that, I mean, most creators, they work from home, they're freelancers, and that has been a huge thing in terms of library promotion. So many people who don't have a traditional office are always using the library too. And so it worked for both promoting the work we do, and I think also the library is a sort of a third space for everybody in the community. So,
very cool. Well, yeah, I guess I think that's probably going to wrap up our show. But Amie, thank you so much for your time today. This is fantastic. If folks want to, if you don't mind, if folks want to reach out to you maybe with some other questions, where can they find you on the internet to do so?
So the best way is to actually reach us. You can reach the Graphic Novel and Comics Roundtable on Twitter, Instagram. We're at LibComics, so LIB as in Bob, COMIX. And if they want to tweet at me directly, I'm at Librarylandia. So I got that handle about 10 years ago when I was like mainlining Portlandia and thought it was real funny.
Well, that's great.
Yep.
I'll make sure to plug all those in the show notes. So make sure you reach out and follow and ask all your library questions to the Roundtable. And yeah, I guess you can follow the rest of us on Twitter. You can follow Kait at KLFear. You can follow Paul at Oh Hi Paulie, and you can follow me at Mike Rappin. And you can follow the show at IRCB Podcast, where we post all sorts of things. We're also on Instagram, so go follow us there too at IRCB Podcast.
This show is powered by fans like you, as well as our subscriber-only episodes, which you can find on Patreon. If you want to find out more and join our Patreon, go to patreon.com/IRCB podcast.
And the first episode of the IRCB Movie Club
that's right.
aired today, March 29th.
Yes.
So you can go listen to it right now. It's fantastic on our Patreon.
If you haven't already, please rate and review our show 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you listen to podcasts.
You can join us over at Discord for hijinks and discussion over there at ircbpodcast.com/Discord. And please make sure to tell friends, even if they don't read comics, please tell them to check out the show. We really appreciate that.
Infinity Shred is the best band in the universe. They do all of our music. We can't thank them enough. Xander is a high wizard who gives great high fives, and he's a fantastic dungeon master. He also edits the show. I want to say thank you to Paul and Kait, and thank you to Amie for being on the show this week. We've loved having you. And until next time, comics are good, and so are you.